The courtroom was packed to the brim that day, with an almost palpable tension hanging in the air. People filled every available seat, their eyes fixed on the proceedings before them. A small but high-profile case had drawn considerable attention, especially given the alleged nature of the crime and the accused. The defendant, a man in his mid-30s with a scruffy beard and cold, hard eyes, sat at the defendant's table, occasionally glancing around the room. His composure was unnerving, calm, detached, as if he were merely a spectator in the story unfolding before him. Judge Marcus Delaney presided over the trial. A veteran in the legal system, he was a man well respected in his profession. Known for his sharp intellect, unwavering commitment to justice, and a steely resolve, Judge Delaney had seen it all. Or at least, that's what everyone thought. He had spent decades in this very courtroom, handling countless cases, some mundane, some terrifying. Murderers, thieves, and con men had passed through the courtroom doors under his gavel, and yet, he never wavered in his duty. Today, however, was different. Something was nagging at him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. The case at hand involved a series of violent crimes, each one more gruesome than the last. The accused was charged with multiple counts of armed robbery and suspected in a string of disappearances that had left the town in a state of fear for the better part of a year. Yet, despite the mounting evidence, the defendant had pled not guilty. His lawyer, a slick attorney with a reputation for defending the indefensible, was working hard to discredit the prosecution's case, arguing technicalities and casting doubt at every opportunity. Judge Delaney sat at his bench, his eyes scanning the faces in the courtroom as the defense attorney rambled on. He was used to this, the grandstanding, the theatrics, but something felt off today. He hadn't slept well the night before, plagued by restless dreams that left him feeling uneasy and out of sorts. It was rare for him to bring his personal life into the courtroom, but lately, things had been difficult at home. His daughter, Claire, had been distant. He chalked it up to the usual teenage angst, but recently, it had begun to worry him. She was 18 now, old enough to start making her own decisions, but she had always been close to him, confiding in him even when she kept things from her mother. Recently, though, there had been a change. Claire had become withdrawn, skipping family dinners, staying out late without explanation, and avoiding his calls. It wasn't like her. Just a few weeks ago, she had started wearing a new necklace, an old-fashioned, almost antique-looking piece with an intricate design. He had asked her about it once, but she had simply shrugged and mumbled something about a friend giving it to her. He hadn't pressed further, figuring it was just a phase, but the thought nagged at him now as he sat in court, his mind wandering when it should have been focused on the trial. The defense attorney's voice droned on, each word pulling Delaney reluctantly back to the present. He forced himself to focus on the matter at hand. The prosecutor had called a key witness earlier that morning, a man who claimed to have seen the defendant near one of the crime scenes on the night in question. The cross-examination was not going well for the prosecution, with the defense tearing apart the witness's credibility and poking holes in his testimony. As the lawyer pressed on, the defendant sat quietly, his hands resting on the table in front of him. Delaney's eyes flicked to the man, scrutinizing him more closely. Something about the way he sat there, so self-assured, made the judge uneasy. The defendant wore a casual jacket, something that almost seemed too ordinary given the serious charges against him. His expression was unreadable, a mask of indifference, but there was something else, something chilling in the way he would occasionally smirk at the questioning. Delaney narrowed his eyes, studying the man in front of him. The defendant seemed almost too calm, too collected. Most people in his position, facing the possibility of spending the rest of their life behind bars, would be a little more anxious. Yet this man sat there, as though he knew something no one else did. The judge's gaze shifted lower, noticing a small detail he hadn't seen before. Around the defendant's neck, tucked partially beneath his shirt, was a necklace that caught the light for a brief moment as the man shifted in his seat. The glint of metal sparked something in Delaney's memory, though at first, he couldn't place it. It was an unusual design, intricate and old-fashioned, just like the one his daughter had been wearing recently. He leaned forward slightly, squinting as he tried to get a better look. The defendant shifted again, causing the necklace to slip further into view, and for the first time, Delaney got a clear look at it. His heart skipped a beat. No, it couldn't be. He blinked, as if trying to shake off the vision in front of him, but when he opened his eyes again, the necklace was still there, hanging around the defendant's neck, the same necklace his daughter had been wearing. The exact same one. His blood ran cold. A wave of nausea hit him, and for a moment, the courtroom seemed to spin around him. He felt as though he had been punched in the gut, the breath knocked out of him. This wasn't possible. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, but there was no logical explanation. How could this man, the accused in a series of brutal crimes, be wearing his daughter's necklace? He had seen it around her neck just days ago. Delaney's vision blurred, his thoughts scattering in all directions as panic began to set in. His hands gripped the edge of the bench in front of him, knuckles white as he fought to steady himself. He couldn't let anyone see him like this. Not here, not now. But the image of that necklace burned in his mind, a terrible, undeniable truth that he couldn't ignore. Somehow, through the fog of his thoughts, Delaney managed to regain his composure, at least outwardly. He forced himself to sit upright, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to focus on the trial again. But it was no use. His mind was elsewhere, fixated on the impossible sight he had just witnessed. The defense attorney's voice faded into the background, a dull hum as Delaney's thoughts raced. How had this happened? Was it a coincidence? No, it couldn't be. The necklace was too unique, too distinctive. He had noticed it immediately when Claire first started wearing it. She had been so secretive about where it had come from, and now, here it was, hanging around the neck of a man accused of unspeakable crimes. He felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck, his pulse quickening as a terrible realization began to take hold. If this man had his daughter's necklace, what did that mean? He tried to push the thought away, tried to cling to some rational explanation, but deep down, he knew something was very, very wrong. The courtroom around him seemed to blur, the faces of the jurors and the spectators fading into the background as Delaney's mind spiraled further into chaos. He couldn't think straight, couldn't process the implications of what he had just seen. All he knew was that he needed answers, and fast. The defense attorney's voice finally broke through the haze, jarring Delaney back to the present. He blinked, realizing that everyone in the room was looking at him, waiting for him to speak. He had missed something, some crucial moment in the trial, and now all eyes were on him. Clearing his throat, Delaney tried to regain control of the situation. I apologize, he stammered, his voice sounding foreign even to his own ears. Could you repeat that last point, counselor? The attorney obliged, but Delaney barely heard him. His mind was still reeling, trapped in the whirlwind of doubt and fear that had taken hold of him. He glanced at the defendant once more, hoping that the necklace had somehow disappeared, that this was all a terrible mistake. But it was still there, gleaming faintly in the light, a silent reminder of the connection between this man and his daughter. Delaney's heart pounded in his chest as he considered his options. Should he halt the trial? Call for a recess? Demand answers? No, he couldn't do that, not yet. He needed more information, needed to understand what was happening before he made any rash decisions. But the urgency gnawed at him, pulling him deeper into the pit of dread that had opened up inside him. The rest of the proceedings passed in a blur. Delaney went through the motions, issuing rulings, listening to arguments, but his mind was elsewhere. Every time he glanced at the defendant, his stomach twisted in knots, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. How could this be happening? The courtroom's atmosphere had shifted, though most of the spectators and participants seemed unaware. What had started as just another day of deliberation had now turned into something far more sinister, at least for Judge Marcus Delaney. He sat stiffly in his seat, barely able to breathe. His mind was racing, attempting to comprehend the overwhelming flood of emotions and information. His eyes kept darting back to the defendant, who sat mere feet away, completely unaware of the storm his simple presence had unleashed. The courtroom noise faded into the background as Marcus focused solely on the necklace around the man's neck. It was small but striking, with an intricately woven silver chain and a pendant that shimmered under the dim lighting of the courtroom. The pendant was unmistakable, circular with a unique design engraved into its surface. He had seen that pattern before. Recently, too recently, his pulse quickened as he stared at it, his mind desperately trying to make sense of how it was possible that this stranger, this man accused of violent and heinous crimes, was wearing the exact same necklace that his own daughter had been wearing not more than a few days ago. Judge Delaney's first instinct was disbelief. His rational mind tried to convince him that it was simply a coincidence, that perhaps there were many necklaces like this one. But the longer he stared, the more certain he became that it was not just any necklace, it was the necklace. The one Claire had begun wearing so suddenly, the one she had been so evasive about when he'd asked where it had come from. At the time, Delaney hadn't thought much of it. Teenage girls were prone to secrets, after all, and it wasn't unusual for Claire to be a little closed off. She had always been a bit independent, strong-willed, and free-spirited. But this necklace, something about it had felt off from the moment he had first seen it on her. It was too distinctive, too ornate for her usual style. She had always preferred simple jewelry, delicate chains or small studs, nothing as bold or eye-catching as the necklace this man was now wearing. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to recall the moment Claire had first worn it. She'd come home late that evening, avoiding eye contact, mumbling something vague when he asked her where she had been. That was unusual for her. Claire had always been close to him. Ever since her mother had left years ago, they'd shared a bond, a trust, even as she moved through the tempestuous teenage years. But lately things had been different. She'd been distant, distracted. He'd chalked it up to the stress of her final year in school, the looming decisions about college, and the natural drift that came with growing up. But now, as he sat in the courtroom, staring at that necklace, a dark, insidious thought began to creep into his mind. What if her distance wasn't about school? What if it wasn't about growing up? What if it had something to do with this man? The very thought made his stomach churn, and his throat tightened as he tried to push it away. No, it wasn't possible. Claire wouldn't be involved with someone like this criminal, this monster. The man sitting in front of him was facing multiple charges, including armed robbery, assault, and there were whispers of worse crimes, unsolved disappearances that the police believed were connected to him. Marcus couldn't allow his mind to go there. It was absurd to even think that his daughter could be connected in any way to such a man. And yet, the necklace hung there, mocking him, daring him to deny the truth that was slowly unraveling in his mind. Delaney's hands gripped the edge of his bench, his knuckles turning white as his heart thudded in his chest. He could feel the panic rising in his throat, but he couldn't afford to lose control. Not here, not now. He was the judge. He had to maintain his composure, keep his wits about him. But every time he looked at the defendant, the necklace gleamed in the light, sending a fresh wave of dread through him. He tried to refocus on the trial, to listen to the defense attorney's arguments, but his mind wouldn't stop racing. Questions buzzed in his head, each one louder and more frantic than the last. How did this man get that necklace? How was it possible that Claire's necklace, the one she had worn so casually at the dinner table just days ago, was now in the possession of this accused criminal? And more terrifyingly, why? Was it possible that Claire had given it to him? Had she? No. He couldn't let himself finish that thought. His daughter was a good girl. She wasn't involved in anything like this. There had to be another explanation. The noise of the courtroom, the shuffle of papers, the murmured conversations, the clinking of the defendant's handcuffs against the wooden table, all seemed to swirl together in a deafening roar inside Delaney's head. He couldn't focus. He needed to get a grip, but every passing second felt like he was sinking further into a nightmare he couldn't wake from. His mind flashed back to that last conversation with Claire. It was a Sunday evening. She'd come home unusually late, her hair slightly disheveled, her clothes wrinkled as if she'd been in a rush to get dressed. He'd asked her where she'd been, trying to keep his tone casual, but she'd only muttered something about being with friends. She wasn't lying, but she wasn't telling the full truth either. He could always tell when she was holding something back. He remembered asking her about the necklace then. "Where'd you get that?" "It looks old," he had said, trying to sound more curious than concerned. She'd only shrugged, not even bothering to make eye contact as she answered, "Oh, it's nothing. Just something a friend gave me." He had pressed a little further, asking which friend, but she had grown visibly irritated, brushing him off with a sigh and a mumbled excuse about homework before retreating to her room. At the time, he'd let it go, figuring it wasn't worth causing a fight over something as trivial as jewelry. But now, that moment played over and over in his mind, each detail more unsettling than the last. Who had given her that necklace? Was it this man? Had Claire been keeping something from him? Something dangerous? The questions swirled, refusing to settle, each one tugging at the edges of a growing dread that threatened to consume him. Judge Delaney sat there, struggling to maintain his composure. The defense attorney's voice continued to drone on, but Marcus barely heard a word. He couldn't shake the feeling that the necklace was staring back at him, an inanimate object now loaded with horrifying implications. It was like a key to a door he was terrified to open, and yet he couldn't look away. The defendant, for his part, seemed completely oblivious to the turmoil his presence had caused. He sat casually, his hands folded in his lap, his expression unreadable. Occasionally, he would glance around the room, his eyes briefly meeting those of the jurors or spectators, but he didn't seem concerned. There was an eerie confidence about him, a smugness that made Delaney's skin crawl. Finally, the defense attorney wrapped up his cross-examination, and the room fell silent for a moment as everyone waited for Delaney to speak. But for a long, agonizing moment, the judge remained quiet, his mind elsewhere. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, waiting for him to respond, but he couldn't bring himself to focus. His mind was still locked on that necklace, the one hanging so innocuously around the neck of a man accused of unspeakable crimes. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained, barely audible. "Let's take a brief recess," he said, his words clipped and hurried. He needed air. He needed time to think. He couldn't stay in that room a second longer, not with that necklace staring back at him, taunting him with its silent accusation. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and the courtroom erupted into movement as people rose from their seats, murmuring to each other as they filed out. But Delaney barely noticed. His mind was consumed with the terrible, growing suspicion that something far worse than he could have ever imagined was unfolding right in front of him. Something that involved not only the man sitting at the defendant's table, but also his own daughter. He rose shakily from his chair, his legs feeling weak beneath him, and made his way toward the judge's chambers. His hands trembled as he reached for the door, his breath coming in shallow, rapid gasps. He needed to pull himself together. He needed to think clearly. But how could he, when the world as he knew it was crumbling beneath his feet? As he stepped into his chambers and shut the door behind him, Marcus Delaney sank into his chair, his head in his hands. He was no longer the calm, composed judge who had spent decades delivering justice. He was now a father in the grip of terror, his heart pounding with the unbearable fear that his daughter was somehow tangled in the web of darkness surrounding this trial. And as the weight of that fear settled over him, pressing down on his chest like a suffocating blanket, one thought stood out above all the others, a question that gnawed at his very soul. How had his daughter's necklace ended up in the possession of this man? The question echoed in his mind, relentless and unanswerable. And as he sat there, lost in the chaos of his own thoughts, the recess ticked on, the trial temporarily on hold. But for Judge Delaney, the real trial was only just beginning. The courtroom walls felt as though they were closing in. Judge Marcus Delaney had never experienced anything like this in all his years presiding over cases. He was a man known for his stoicism, his ability to maintain an unflappable demeanor even in the most disturbing of trials. But today, he felt like a man on the edge of a precipice, his body betraying him in a way he couldn't control. His chest tightened, his breathing quickened, and the steady pulse of panic hammered through his veins as though a vice was closing in on his ribs. The defendant's face, the cold, emotionless mask, hovered in the periphery of his vision. His eyes kept darting back to the necklace around the man's neck, that single object which now held a gravity so immense it seemed to draw the air from the room. It wasn't just a necklace anymore. It was a lifeline to something far worse, something his mind wasn't ready to confront. Time seemed to warp. It stretched and twisted like a cruel rubber band, pulling tighter and tighter, until Marcus felt it might snap altogether. Everything in the room had taken on a surreal quality, as if he were watching a dream unfold from outside his body. A nightmare, more like it. His daughter's necklace, there, on the neck of a criminal accused of violent crimes. Judge Delaney was supposed to be impartial. He was supposed to be above personal feelings, able to mete out justice without allowing emotions to cloud his judgment. But now? How could he remain impartial when his entire world was tilting off its axis? The defendant, a man named Brandon Murdoch, hadn't noticed the judge's growing distress. He sat, calm and collected, his fingers occasionally drumming the table in front of him. There was something about his demeanor, detached, indifferent, that sent chills down Delaney's spine. Murdoch didn't even seem particularly concerned about the charges being laid at his feet. That same, smug expression never left his face, as though he were simply waiting for something, as though he knew something no one else did. And why not? He was holding a secret in plain sight, a secret that Marcus couldn't untangle. How had he come into possession of Claire's necklace? That question rang in Marcus's mind again and again, growing louder with each repetition. He thought back to that moment when he first saw the necklace on Claire. She had walked into the kitchen that morning, her hair still damp from the shower, with a nervous energy about her. She had tried to act casual, but Marcus could tell something was bothering her. Then, he saw the necklace, delicate, intricate, completely out of place among her usual simple jewelry. He had asked her about it. He'd wanted to know where it came from, who had given it to her. But Claire had brushed him off with that half-smile she used when she didn't want to talk about something. "It's just a gift," she had said, her tone too light, too dismissive. Now that memory gnawed at him with vicious persistence. What had he missed? What had she hidden from him? His fingers tightened around the edges of his bench as he tried to focus on the trial, but it was no use. His mind was being swallowed whole by questions that had no immediate answers. His body felt leaden, as if an invisible weight were pressing down on him. His heart beat erratically, a wild rhythm out of sync with the calm exterior he tried to maintain. He glanced at the jury, at the attorneys, at the spectators. None of them seemed aware of the storm brewing inside him. To them, this was just another day in court. To Marcus, this was the beginning of an unraveling, something far more personal and destructive. He could feel it in his bones. A faint sheen of sweat had formed on his forehead, despite the cool air circulating through the room. The gavel, still clutched tightly in his hand, felt like an anchor tethering him to some semblance of normalcy. His mind was a cyclone, spinning faster and faster with every passing second, but outwardly he couldn't let it show. He was the judge. He was the authority. No one could know the turmoil that had begun to engulf him. Delaney's throat tightened, and he swallowed hard, trying to push the nausea back down. He felt as though the room was tilting around him, but no one seemed to notice. The prosecutor was questioning a witness, something about the defendant's whereabouts on the night of one of the robberies. But the words sounded distant, hollow. The details of the case blurred together, fading into the background as the necklace, the glinting, silver reminder of his daughter, loomed larger in his mind. He closed his eyes for just a moment, trying to steady his breathing. He could feel the tension building behind his eyes, a dull throbbing that threatened to turn into a full-blown migraine. His thoughts were spiraling out of control, but he couldn't afford to let them. Not here, not in front of everyone. He had to focus, had to compartmentalize the chaos swirling inside him. But how could he? His thoughts kept returning to Claire, to the way she had been acting lately. The late nights, the secretive behavior, the distance that had grown between them. He had brushed it off as teenage rebellion, the normal growing pains of a young woman finding her independence. But now, everything felt wrong. Something darker was at play, something he hadn't seen, hadn't been able to protect her from. Delaney's breath hitched in his chest. Claire was his world. Ever since her mother had left, it had just been the two of them, navigating life together. He had raised her on his own, and despite the challenges, they had always been close. Or at least, he had thought they were. Now, doubt gnawed at him, vicious and relentless. Had she been hiding something from him all along? Something dangerous? The thought was unbearable. His grip on the gavel tightened until his knuckles turned white. He was losing control, something he had never allowed to happen in all his years on the bench. His body was betraying him, and his mind was following suit. He had to get a hold of himself. He couldn't let the panic consume him here, not in front of the courtroom, not in front of his colleagues and the jury. He took a deep, shaky breath, trying to ground himself, but as his eyes opened, they were drawn once again to the defendant and that glinting silver chain. It felt like a noose tightening around his heart. Every logical part of his mind screamed that it was just a coincidence, that it couldn't possibly be the same necklace. But the gut-wrenching fear that was tearing through him told a different story, a story that was far more dangerous, far more personal. The prosecutor had finished questioning the witness, and now the defense was preparing to cross-examine. But Delaney's mind was elsewhere. He could hardly keep track of the proceedings anymore. His eyes flicked again and again to the defendant, trying to decipher something, anything, in the man's face that could explain this nightmare. But Murdoch's expression remained impassive, detached. If he noticed the judge's growing unease, he didn't show it. Marcus felt his pulse quicken again, his vision blurring slightly at the edges. His breath was shallow, his thoughts disjointed. The courtroom felt too small, too confining. The walls seemed to press in on him, and for the first time in his career, he felt completely powerless. The gavel slipped slightly in his damp palm as he struggled to maintain his composure. Then, the defendant turned his head, just slightly, but enough that their eyes met. For a brief second, Marcus felt as if the world had stopped. His heart skipped a beat, and the blood rushed to his ears, drowning out all sound. Murdoch's eyes were cold, calculating, but there was something else, something that chilled Delaney to his core. A knowing look, as if the man had been waiting for this moment, as if he knew exactly what was running through the judge's mind. Murdoch's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile, barely perceptible, but their IT was a taunt, a silent, wordless challenge. He knew. Somehow, he knew that a wave of dizziness hit Delaney so hard he thought he might fall out of his chair. His hands gripped the sides of the bench as he fought to steady himself, but the room was spinning now. He couldn't breathe. His chest constricted painfully, and his heart pounded in his ears like a drumbeat, relentless and deafening. The world around him was dissolving, fading into a haze of fear and confusion. He couldn't focus on anything except the horrible realization that was dawning on him with a sickening certainty. Murdoch knew. He had Claire's necklace, and that could only mean one thing. The terror that gripped Marcus in that moment was unlike anything he had ever experienced before. It was primal, visceral, the kind of fear that claws at your very soul and refuses to let go. His daughter was in danger. She had to be. His vision swam, and for a brief moment, he thought he might lose consciousness. The weight of everything, the trial, the necklace, the unbearable suspicion that his daughter was somehow entangled in all of this, pressed down on him like a tidal wave, threatening to pull him under. He had to act. He had to do something. But what? How could he confront this man, this monster, without losing his grip on the trial, without revealing the terrible personal conflict that was tearing him apart inside? His breath came in short, ragged gasps now, and he could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him. He was losing control, slipping further and further into the abyss of panic and dread. But there was no escape. Not here. Not now. He was trapped in this moment, a helpless witness to the unraveling of his life, his family, and his very sense of reality. And as the recess dragged on, as the trial continued, Judge Marcus Delaney knew with a chilling certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. The courtroom, now awash in a heavy and stifling tension, had transformed into a battleground of silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of papers or a cough from one of the jurors. Judge Marcus Delaney sat at the helm of it all, the weight of his gavel somehow inconsequential compared to the monumental burden that had settled on his chest. His hands trembled, betraying the composed facade he had tried so hard to maintain. Every breath felt labored, as though the air itself had turned against him, thickening and constricting around his throat. He couldn't stop his eyes from wandering again, pulled irresistibly to the defendant sitting before him. Brandon Murdoch, accused of a string of violent robberies, stared ahead with that same unreadable expression. His face, calm and calculating, held none of the fear or remorse Marcus had seen in countless other defendants. It was unnerving, chilling even, but nothing compared to the true horror that gripped Marcus every time his gaze fell upon the necklace dangling from the man's neck. It gleamed in the fluorescent courtroom light, a simple yet intricately crafted piece of silver, with a pendant that seemed to catch every flicker of brightness and transform it into something alive. That necklace, it was more than just jewelry. It was a relic, an anchor, a symbol of everything Marcus feared had been shattered beyond repair. It was the very same necklace his daughter Claire had worn only days before, the one she had refused to explain. And now, here it was, hanging casually around the neck of a criminal whose presence in this courtroom was tearing Marcus's world apart. As the minutes ticked by, each one slower than the last, a terrible realization had taken root in Marcus's mind, growing like a poison. Claire wasn't just connected to this trial by some distant, tragic coincidence. No, she was tangled up in it in ways he hadn't yet dared to fully understand. The evidence was right in front of him, mocking him with its clarity. And now, as the trial continued, Marcus found himself trapped, both as a judge, sworn to uphold the law, and as a father, desperate to protect his child. The recess had done little to calm his nerves. He had retreated to his chambers, splashing cold water on his face in a futile attempt to regain some semblance of control. But no amount of water could wash away the growing dread inside him. His reflection in the mirror had been that of a man lost, grappling with an impossible truth. And now, as he returned to his seat, the courtroom felt even more suffocating, the walls closing in around him. The trial resumed with the same methodical pace, but Marcus barely heard the words being spoken. His mind was elsewhere, running through every possible scenario, every piece of evidence that could explain how Claire had become involved with a man like Murdoch. Was it a mistake? Could there be some innocent explanation for the necklace, for her sudden secrecy? Or was it worse than he had ever imagined? He thought of the nights she had come home late, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly as she mumbled excuses about study groups and staying at friends' houses. He had dismissed his concerns then, telling himself it was normal teenage behavior. But now, every one of those moments seemed to take on a darker hue. What had he missed? What hadn't he seen? Marcus's hands shook as he gripped the gavel, trying to steady himself. He had to focus, had to keep his emotions in check. But how could he, when every fiber of his being was screaming that something was terribly, terribly wrong? As the prosecution continued questioning witnesses, Marcus forced himself to listen, his attention flickering back to the present moment. The testimonies were damning. Murdoch had been connected to the crimes in nearly every conceivable way. Witnesses placed him at the scenes, surveillance footage captured his likeness, and physical evidence tied him directly to the violent acts that had left several people injured and one dead. The case against him was strong, ironclad even, but none of that mattered to Marcus right now. All that mattered was Claire, his daughter, his heart. She was in danger. He could feel it in his bones. And as much as he wanted to believe that she had simply been caught up in something beyond her control, a darker, more insidious fear gnawed at him. What if she wasn't just a bystander? What if she had willingly entered this world? What if Murdoch wasn't just a criminal, but someone who had a hold over her? The thought was almost too much to bear. His mind wandered back to the last conversation they'd had, just 2 nights ago. Claire had been quiet, distant, her usual warmth replaced by an uncharacteristic coldness. She had avoided his gaze, her answers clipped and vague. When he had asked her how she was, if anything was wrong, she had simply shrugged, brushing him off with a casual, "I'm fine, Dad. Don't worry about me." But now, in the harsh light of everything that had transpired, those words seemed hollow, an empty reassurance hiding something far more dangerous. What had she gotten herself into? Marcus's throat tightened, his mouth dry. He had to find a way to talk to her, to ask her the questions that had been haunting him since the moment he saw that necklace around Murdoch's neck. But how? He couldn't leave the bench in the middle of a trial. He couldn't show any sign of weakness or personal conflict. The integrity of the court depended on it. And yet, with every passing second, The urgency to protect his daughter grew more intense, like a fire consuming him from within. Suddenly, the defense attorney's voice cut through Marcus's thoughts like a knife. "Your Honor," he said, his tone sharp, "I'd like to call the defendant to the stand." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. Murdoch was going to testify. This was it, the moment he had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The man who held the key to the mystery surrounding Claire would finally speak, and Marcus would be forced to sit there, mere feet away, pretending to be impartial, when all he wanted to do was scream at him, demand answers, demand to know what he had done to his daughter. Murdoch rose from his seat and made his way to the witness stand with the same unnerving calm he had displayed throughout the trial. He moved with a predator's grace, slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving Marcus's. It was as if the rest of the courtroom had fallen away, leaving only the two of them, judge and defendant, locked in a silent, terrible battle. The bailiff swore Murdoch in, and the defense attorney began his questioning, starting with the usual softballs meant to paint his client in a more sympathetic light. But Marcus barely heard the words. His focus was entirely on Murdoch's face, searching for any sign of guilt, any flicker of emotion that might reveal the truth. But there was nothing. Murdoch remained calm, his voice steady as he answered the questions with practiced ease. Then, the defense attorney shifted gears, moving to the heart of the matter. "Mr. Murdoch," he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "there has been a great deal of evidence presented that ties you to the crimes in question. How do you respond to that?" Murdoch smiled, just a small, almost imperceptible curl of his lips, and glanced over at Marcus before answering. "I've done some things in my life that I'm not proud of," he said, his voice low and measured. "But I didn't do this." The lie was palpable, hanging in the air like a noxious cloud. Marcus could feel it, and he was certain the jury could too. But Murdoch's delivery was smooth, calculated. He was playing a game that Marcus had no choice but to watch unfold. The defense attorney pressed on, asking about the night of the most violent robbery, the one where a store clerk had been killed. Murdoch's answers were slippery, evasive, but always delivered with that same unsettling calm. And then, without warning, the defense attorney changed the subject entirely. "Mr. Murdoch," he said, his voice casual but pointed, "can you tell the court about the necklace you're wearing?" Marcus's blood ran cold. Murdoch glanced down at the silver chain hanging around his neck, and for the first time since the trial had begun, a flicker of something, satisfaction, perhaps, crossed his face. "This?" Murdoch said, his fingers lightly brushing the pendant. "It's just a gift. From someone special." The room seemed to spin. Marcus gripped the edge of his bench, his knuckles white as the words reverberated in his mind. Someone special. The implication was unmistakable, and it hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. Claire, he wanted to stand up, to shout, to demand answers. But he couldn't. Not here. Not now. He was trapped, forced to watch as Murdoch dangled the truth just out of reach, knowing full well the torment it was causing. The prosecutor objected, calling the question irrelevant, and the judge had no choice but to sustain it. But the damage was done. Murdoch had planted the seed, and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that it was a message, one meant specifically for him. As the questioning continued, Marcus's mind raced. He had to talk to Claire. He had to find out what was going on, what connection she had to this man. But the trial wasn't over, and until it was, he was powerless to act. He could only sit there, a prisoner of his own role, as the truth remained just out of reach. And then, just when Marcus thought he couldn't take any more, the moment he had feared most arrived. The defense attorney finished his questioning, and the prosecutor stood to begin the cross-examination. He wasted no time, diving straight into the heart of the case, challenging Murdoch on the inconsistencies in his alibi, the overwhelming evidence that tied him to the crimes. But Murdoch was a master at deflection, answering every question with the same maddening calm. And then, almost as if it were an afterthought, the prosecutor asked, "Mr. Murdoch, do you know Claire Delaney?" The room fell silent. Marcus's heart stopped. He could feel every eye in the courtroom turned toward him, but he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Murdoch's lips curled into that same sinister smile. "Claire," he said, his voice dripping with false innocence. "Yeah, I know her." The world seemed to shatter around Marcus as those words echoed in his mind. His worst fears had been confirmed. Claire was connected to Murdoch, and now there was no escaping the truth. The trial continued, but Marcus was no longer present. He was lost in a whirlwind of fear, anger, and helplessness. His daughter was in danger, and he didn't know how to save her. As the gavel came down, signaling the end of the day's proceedings, Marcus knew that nothing would ever be the same. The line between his role as a judge and his role as a father had blurred beyond recognition, and now he was faced with an impossible choice: justice or family, truth or protection. As he stood to leave the courtroom, his mind raced with the weight of the decision that loomed before him. And as the door closed behind him, Marcus Delaney knew that the trial was far from over.